Hello guys, and welcome to my summer and booktubeathon wrap-up. I'm going to be talking about all the books I read in June, July and during booktubeathon. And I really didn't get as many books read as I would have wanted to, but I still tried my best, and there are a few books that I really want to discuss with you. So let's get started. In June, I only managed to read the one book, which is The Wall of Storms by Ken Liu, and I made a full review of this, which you can check out if you want to. And I buddy read this with Caitlin and James from Kitty G and James Chatham respectively. I will put links to their channels down in the description. And I had a really fun time buddy reading this with them. This was the first buddy read I had ever done with anyone on BookTube, and it was really fun and engaging, and we were messaging each other constantly, and James took a bit longer to finish it, but when he started commenting on things, me and Caitlin were kind of vicariously living through him and in kind of emotionally recreating the feeling we had when we read this book, and this book is just amazing. I gave this 5 stars, and I really recommend everyone picking up Dandelion Dynasty because it is just great. If you are kind of unsure about continuing on with it after Grace of Kings, I will say that this is a huge improvement on pretty much every aspect on Grace of Kings. So this is definitely a series that gets better as it goes on, kind of like fine wine, if you will. After Wall of Storms, I moved on to The Dispossessed by Ursula K. Le Guin, and I buddy read this with Anita from Anita Lind. I will also put her channel down below. And I really like this book. It was really engaging, and I really love Le Guin's writing style, but this story is also very intimate and kind of isolated, because isolation is one of the themes of this book. But that meant that the focus was solely on the one main character. Kind of all the other side characters kind of felt a little bit flat, because we were constantly seeing the story just from the point of view of one character. It did get a little bit better towards the end, but for the most part in this book you are really just in the head of the main character Shevek, and if you kind of can't get over that, I think it's going to be a bit hard to get into this book. So you need to take that into account when you read this. But I really love this. You can really tell that this was written during the 70s, because there's a lot of references to communism and kind of capitalism, and the juxtaposition between kind of communist and capitalist government is very prominent in this book. And I really love the exploration of different kinds of corruption in both of these settings that we explore in this story. And I had a lot of fun reading it with Anita. Even though both of us took quite a bit of time to read this, I still very much enjoyed it. And I gave this book 3.5 stars and rounded it up to 4 for Goodreads. So it was definitely a very worthy read for me. And those were the books I read outside of the readathon, and next I'm going to move on to the books I read during booktubeathon. So I completed 5 out of the 7 challenges. I read a book with a person on the cover. I finished a book in a day. In fact, I finished a lot of books in a single day. I read about characters that were completely different from me. I read a cover by, and I read 7 books. I did not read outdoors. I did not even try. The weather was completely off for me, and it was gloomy and horrible, and I just wanted to curl in a blanket, and that's what I did, and I'm not ashamed of it. And I also did not manage to read my pick for a hyped book because I ran out of time. But yeah, let's just talk about the books that I did read. First up, Temporary People by Deepak Unikrishnan. This book was a struggle for me. I was really excited for it. It was one of my most anticipated reads because the premise sounded really intriguing. short stories about immigrants and kind of illegal workers in the Arab Emirates. Sounds amazing, right? What the blurb doesn't really tell you is that most of the stories are kind of magical realism. So that was a really huge surprise for me. Reading this book was a real struggle, because not only were the stories kind of connected by these little almost random vignettes and random details, but they were like really all over the place. Like the whole book starts with a story that is really grounded in kind of reality, with this woman kind of working as a nurse or a doctor for these workers who get caught in accidents during the in the construction sites, and they can't be treated in like normal hospitals, so she has to go to the construction sites and either try to fix them up in secret or help them die. And that was a really interesting story. I really liked it. There are also poems interspersed between different like chapters, which I also really liked. But then there were some really, dare I say, offensive kind of stories. And don't get me wrong, I have no problem with authors using vulgar language or anything, but in this it just felt so out of place. It didn't need to be there. And I felt that this book was very mean-spirited in many ways, because there's so many times that these stories belittle women, belittle sexual minorities, and show these people whose plight we're supposed to be sympathetic for, show these people in a very unsympathetic light. You cannot root for any of the people in this cast, basically. And I pretty much took 5 days reading this book. I read other books during this time because I was constantly trying to kind of get away from this book, but I didn't want to DNF it, so I stuck through with it, and I gave it 2 stars because the prose is pretty good. Like, the writing style is kind of fresh, but the substance is not something that I enjoy at all. And yeah, this book just was not for me. Next up, I read the Marx Trilogy, which is a graphic novel series created by John Lewis, and it is about the civil rights movement in the United States. And I really love that comic book series. The art was really beautiful. It was this black and white kind of ink paintings, ink drawings kind of style, juxtaposed with kind of pencil sketches to represent TV and radio and photographs from that time, which I thought was a nice touch. And I really liked it. I gave the whole series 4 stars, and I would recommend everyone read it because it is a very crucial part of human history. I have to say that it was also very brutal. It is a very gut-wrenching read. I wasn't actually prepared for the brutality of the comic because I have learned about civil rights movement somewhat, but my whole education of it really extends to Hollywood portrayals in film. And let's just say that Hollywood films tend to gloss over many things. They usually try to make the white characters a little bit more sympathetic, kind of showing the kind of focusing more on the look, there were allies and stuff, which is true. There were, but it gets to a point where it kind of paints a very dare I say whitewashed picture for people who have not experienced it as their own history, like myself. I had no idea it was that brutal, because I've not learned about civil rights movement in school, because we focused more on, Russia and European history, and American history was more like an optional course you could take if you so chose. I consider this comic book series a very good first step in educating yourself about the civil rights movement, which is precisely why I asked Books by Leynes to recommend me some books to read about the civil rights movement, and she recommended this precise book series to me. And I'm really glad she did, because I really liked it, even though it really left me feeling kind of depressed afterwards, because it is always very hard and difficult to read about that much cruelty. Next up I have Miss Pettigrew Lives for a Day by Winifred Watson, and I quite enjoyed it. Like, I gave this book 3 stars. It is okay. It was quick paced. The whole story takes place in the span of a single day, hence the name. So it is a very quick paced story. Everything happens in like dang dang dang, like constant action. Okay? But I have to say that even though I enjoyed the pace and I enjoyed the quick-witted dialogue and what have you, this book has really not aged well. You can really see the 30s kind of attitude towards everything in this book, and it is very pervasive. Like the gender dynamics and also the racial dynamics and attitudes are very reminiscent of the 30s in this, and there are some really toxic relationships that are supported by the narrative in this book, because that was how it was back then. That was the attitude. And yeah, so I kind of had to read this book constantly reminding myself, okay, this book was written in the 30s. It represents the 30s. It's not meant for a modern audience, or it was not written for a modern audience. But I do think that this book manages to still be very entertaining. I read this in like 8 or 7 hours, so I would say that this is also a very good slump killer, because it is a romp, kind of romantic Cinderella story about a 40-year-old spinster, which is kind of refreshing to see a female character that is on the older side, because you don't usually get to see that so much. So if you can get past the outdated gender dynamics and kind of racist undertones, then you may well enjoy this, but just remember those caveats. And the last 2 books I read were The Happy Prince and Other Tales by Oscar Wilde and The Sea Tiger by Victoria Turnbull. I read these both in a day. In fact, I read these in like 2 hours. This took me about half an hour because I was ogling all the pictures, and this took me a couple of hours to read. And I really enjoyed both. I gave them both 4 stars, and I actually read them during the first day of the booktubeathon, and I was feeling really great about myself, like, yeah, I'm reading tons of books today. And then I started reading Temporary People, and that kind of ruined it. But anyway, I really enjoyed these. I find that Oscar Wilde's fairy tales are more like fairy tales for all ages, because he has things for everyone. Like children will enjoy the whimsy, and there is a lot of like sassiness and snark for adults to enjoy, which is great, and also like criticism of society. And with Sea Tiger, this was basically a very nice and warm story about friendship, and a story of a lonely merboy who has only a single friend, who is the sea tiger, and the sea tiger helps him find new friends and kind of be more social, which is really, really nice. And I really enjoyed them. And there you have it. This has been my summer wrap-up and booktubeathon wrap-up. If you enjoyed this video, consider giving that thumbs up and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and I will see you in the next video. Bye!